So you're right. I think there is something to borrow from that field, and but I'm not sure how they're going to be adapted. But I think that's
Yeah.
really good analogy right there.
Mm. And there's going to
Yes.
be back and forth. Basically, what we'll learn about the models. So we discussed a lot about like customization and personalization of like you have a task and you want to learn how your model is performing on your task and across a different set of criteria. As we learn this and we know how to better do that, that's something we're going to bring then to evaluation, either like in academic setting or like in like work setting or evaluation of being able to have better metrics and to evaluate them more properly.
I'm very excited to talk to you since I have been following your own work in the LLM evaluation specifically, and you have been doing a tremendous work in the domain. And I'm very excited to have you in this podcast and to dive deep with you. So thank you for taking the time to be here.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss. It's always very nice to like exchange ideas and research topics around this. So very glad to have this happening.
I really appreciate it. Maybe we can start by if you can give us just maybe some introduction and background about your own yourself and your specific work in academia and in the LLM evaluation topic specifically.
Yeah, sure. So I guess as you've said, I'm coming from France. So I had, in terms of academic background, I trained over there in like theoretical mathematics and physics. So French are very good at theoretical things, not that good at like implementing them necessarily. So that's why that pushed me towards the US after my studies. And I went to do like the grad studies at MIT and Harvard around that. By then, the main focus I was interested in was regarding topics of personalization. That is, how you create experience which are unique to each of the users, how you create module around that. And interestingly, back then, there were very few of those products that were like AI powered. Basically, you had like Netflix recommendations, Spotify, but that was the most advanced you could do to adapt to the user. And then interestingly, like back then at the end of the studies, I joined Amazon to start to work on like LLM related topics, which were something like that started to emerge. And a couple of months after, there was that like ChatGPT explosion happened with all the things. And since then, I've been mostly working within Amazon on like building LLM related products. And in particular, I would say quite specializing on the evaluation part of those products, which is, as we'll discuss extensively, one of the central topics that comes very quickly
Yeah,
around
that
there.
is absolutely great. I have been talking to so many guests in the topic. I don't know if you have been following the podcast. And every time I talk to anybody who's working in the domain of LLM evaluation, I think the main topic is the how we can create a sufficient metrics to evaluate the performance. So I would like you maybe to shed the light in what are the current performance metrics that used to evaluate the LLMs, and what limitation do they have in truly assessing the capability of those models?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'll discuss by them. I guess I see three challenge when we're building LLMs and we're trying to evaluate them. The first one is so I will like briefly, there is the lack of like custom evaluation metrics. What we see with customers, what we see when we design LLM powered system is that you're not necessarily interested in knowing like in general how your LLM is performing, like is it good at math or like in general. What you want is for a very specific task you're building on to know like how is my model doing for this task. And the challenge is that the general performance of the models, which I conveyed to like the famous or like all the open source benchmarks, like on Hugging Face or like on papers, those are not necessarily related to the performance on narrow and specific customer-based tasks. So this challenge is like, how do I get my custom evaluation metrics to work well? And one point I guess we'll come back to is a lot of those LLM systems, I think I've seen numbers around like 70% of them, they tend to rely on retrieval augmented generation. So what that means is on those products you're building, not only you use like an LLM for custom tasks, but you're also bringing some custom knowledge. And you want to know how well is your LLM performing with this custom knowledge. So this constraint number one is I get my custom task. I want to know how is my product performing on that. And the product goes beyond the LLM. Now the challenge number two, as you said, is there is a lack of like suited metrics. Like a lot of the like classical ML problems, well, you were working on custom problems, but you tend to have like metrics which are fairly indicative and like predictive over there. One of the challenge of the LLM is I see it as like you want to build a metric that says like this is I have 10% accuracy or like 200 points of this on my task. And I would say very frankly, so far it's almost impossible to get to this level. So I like to group the type of metric that exists in three families. So in terms of like I would guess level of automation somehow you could yeah. The first one is like the classical metrics which were invented at the beginning of like or at the early stage of the NLP field. So semantic based metrics. So there is the rouge score, the bleu score, like a bunch of others. And those one originated mostly around the field of translation and they're like kind of designed for fairly specific tasks. Yeah, exactly like translation task of how do I go from English to like French and so on. So they built around like some ideas of playing around like bag of words or like very much semantic. And for those tasks, they tend to perform fairly well. At least people worked on that for quite some time and managed to improve them. One of the challenges is that as soon as you try to bring them towards more complex tasks, typically like open-ended question where you would say to an LLM, how would I do this? And the answer is going to be like 5 paragraph long. Those tasks do not correlate anymore with like human judgment, those type of metrics. So they don't correlate very well. They're not super indicative. That's not something we want to maximize in practice. And even if I look at the root score for my task, I won't have a super great like kind of indicator. So there is this interpretability limitation as well. Like if you tell me you have a root score of 0.5, I don't really know what it means
True.
effectively. So that's one of the things. And I tend to put in this same box the like so rouge, bleu, and others. They play with the words, so they say like they do bag of words of a few sentence. They break it into chunks of paragraph, and they look at overlap. There is also some some embedding based metrics which are not exactly using the same idea. So like there is bird score or like meteor or others around there, but I would say they typically have the same limitations around there. Of you don't correlate super well with the human judgment, and you give me a bird score of 0.5, I don't really know what to do with that. And whenever I tend to
Mhm.
maximize it, I don't get necessarily the perfect score. So I would say that's in terms of the metric. So that's family one, the semantic based metric, the classical one, old style. The convenient thing for those ones is that they're automated. So they're very fast to compute. Typically they work well.
Got it.
On the other extreme, the other type of like metric, the extreme opposite would be like having expert in the loops or humans. So for those one,
Mhm.
you will say like, here is the question I asked to my language model. Here is the answer the model gets. How do you score this one? So the good thing is like, it's fairly easy for an expert to do something like this type of task. And so they can understand the score, they can score the answers, and you can give them some instructions that tend to follow pretty well. And whenever we build proof of concept of LLM, typically that's what we do. We like, as the like, we get a sample of like 10 or 20 questions, and then we try to prompt the model and improve on that. So I would say that's almost the go-to metric. But the limitations I see at this point, or like one of the main limitation around this is like cost and speed. Like when I want to iterate and test 10 models at the same time on 500 questions, it's typically very expensive and fairly slow to get humans to rank all 500 questions for the 500 models. So that's one of the things that pushes us towards automation. And the question is how you do the automation properly. Another like slightly more downstream limitation of this type of metrics, of like the expert in the loop, is the notion of calibration. That is, I can ask the same question to two different experts, and it's typically difficult for them to say like to
Mhm.
have the same homogeneous score of like how is good is this from 1 to 5. There is some small form of some at least form of bias you want to
Mhm.
control or like kind of edge against at this point. Does it make sense so far? Like any questions or things?
It make a lot of sense, and it's funny that you mentioned this kind of collaboration between human. That's why I think we have inter annotator agreement to
Mm,
measure how much those agreement that we have, and maybe what are the examples that actually causing a lot of confusion between the different experts. And
Mm,
it's funny because sometimes even the same exact expert, if you pass them the same
mm,
exact question and answers, they might have different ranking. If you ask them to do ranking, they might have different rankings based on their time of the day, which is,
yeah.
I find it funny. So it's not 100% reliable, and it's a reflection of the way how we think as a human. So definitely, beside the cost and the time consuming, we have this kind of like human based, I would call it biased, or we call it whatever, but that just it gave you that kind of limitation as well. So that's great. You started by laying down the foundation of what we have been working with so far in the traditional machine learning. You moved into human evaluation. Before jumping into the automated effort, which is, I
Mm,
think that's what people need to know exactly. Uh, I need to look into the human evaluation and ask you, like, how much we still involve the human in the process. Is it like that much of involvement, or is has been reduced during time? Uh,
mm.
at least for the last 2 years, I would say.
It's a very good question. I would tend to say humans apparently are being less involved, or like that's the message which is being communicated about like LLMs are now able to do the tasks that humans were doing previously. But I would say we're still at a point where we don't manage to like properly do the automation for most of those tasks. So under the hood, like humans are still like a core piece of the system, at least at this early
Mm.
stage of like discovering and playing with this new technology. And whenever you look at like the top companies, top AI companies, they have like batches of humans annotators, which are helping them for most of the tasks, involving evaluation, but not only. So like kind of all those aspects of like generating the training data for the models, improving it, doing the labeling, doing some form of content filtration as well. Every single
Mhm.
of those steps require like people actually doing the manualing, doing the labeling, creating the data. And what's going to be interesting is, as of now, some of this work could be potentially automated. Basically, there is some of the task where it's interesting to know, like, basically, we could hope that an LLM would do a better job. And it's also interesting because not only would do a better job, but also at scale. So some of those tasks, I believe, in the coming months or years are going to be like almost fully automated as long as we like as soon as we start to better understand the criteria which we should use to automate all the techniques to create the data and so on. What's going to be more interesting is that I suspect there will be other set of tasks which are going to emerge for which humans are going to continue to like stay in. One interesting example of those would be like the pattern reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is something which has proven to work very well, or like to be a key factor in the success of the top models. For those one, what happens behind is that you want to learn the human preference. So I give you two answers from a model, and I want to know, like, on average, for whom, like, what's your preference across those two answers? And there's a lot of interesting trade-off. Like we discussed this a bit previously, but all the aspect of like safety, helpfulness, and so on. People have their own set of criteria, and you want to be able for your model to know this beforehand. And I suspect for those tasks, the best way is still going to be to ask the users. Like, there is no way to learn the preference of somebody without like actually involving him in the loop. But the challenge, like the what's going to be interesting from the human annotator perspective is that humans are going to be implied in the task with like higher stakes and more decisions and like more impact on the downstream model, rather than being involved in the task which could potentially be automated and where like that are more like undifferentiated. But oh yeah, please go. You
Yes,
want?
I just wanted to understand like the rule of the culture limitation and the languages, because each language has their own understanding. And since we
Mm,
when we deal with the LLMs, you are dealing with the human language. And human language, it's propagating and inheriting like its own complexity from each one of those cultures. So I was wondering how much reliance, yes, we can use the human, but how much we can rely on them on like just putting us in the right track in this case.
mm. Yeah, that's a very good question. Like this, and the humans you use, it's also a sample of the population. Basically, even just if you say like the models are going to interact, like users are interacting with the models, which in turns collect more data and learns to like better satisfy what the users are looking for. Well, I would say the user base of the people using ChatGPT these days is also super narrow. Like it's a subset of the population, fairly specific. And
Hmm.
that's even in some of the countries. As you move beyond and you go to other countries, other type of culture, you're also interested in like capturing how would the people interact, what would be the best experience for them, and how would the model understand what they're looking for and what they mean in a certain sense. And that's the interesting part of, I would say, you could see the translation. Like you could say, well, a different language is just like translating the words, but they try to mean the same thing. Whereas at the end,
Hmm.
two people can have a like completely different meaning for like saying the same sentence. And growing as a foreigner in like different countries, you realize that pretty fast on this. I would say there's gonna be a lot of work on being able. So so far the way we use the like annotator agreements or those type of human like collection tasks and we evaluated them was for things which were pretty well defined. So for instance, for autonomous car, you could say like, please annotate like this kind of video. And if an annotator showed you like the video with the car and it got something wrong, you could very clearly spot like this is incorrect. So we built metrics to evaluate the annotation, but those metrics had a form of ground truth to do it. So what's going to be challenging is that for this type of technologies, we move towards field where there is no ground truth. So it's going to be almost impossible to say to an annotator like, this is correct or this is incorrect. All of it is going to be subjective judgment. And we'll need to have ways of like understanding, like said a bit differently, like an annotator is going to, or like a human is going to make a micro decision saying like, I prefer this sentence to this sentence, or I tend to believe this way of answering the question is going to be better than this way. And if you just look at the small picture, well, this decision is like seemingly like not that important. It's like one way of phrasing thing versus another. And what's going to be very difficult is to find ways of aggregating that and saying, well, if 2,000 people make this same type of decision, on which
Hmm.
direction am I pushing my model? What's the type of behavior is it going to learn? How is it going to behave on aggregates? And
Yeah, I think
I
one
don't
of the
see it.
things that we used before is the majority vote, where we took
Mm,
like the majority vote among the annotators, and just to assess which one is more reliable, especially when it comes to ranking. Ranking, even like it's much more harder task, because you're not gonna have any two or three annotators giving you the same rankings. Like
mm,
especially if you have like five different answers for the same prompt, it's near impossible to have the same exact two annotators agreeing in the ranking, because at the end of the day it's a language, it's fluid, it's like you
yeah,
mentioned, the impact of the rule and the culture and the dialect. Like somebody from Paris maybe not going to have the
mm,
same exact ranking as somebody from South France, you know what I mean? So maybe the culture has
yeah,
some influence in understanding those languages.
yeah,
And I think I'm trying to spend some time in the human evaluation, because I know for sure that the automated part of the LLM evaluation, it's always trying to mimic the human behavior and how
mm.
we do the evaluation in the first place. So I don't know if you want to spend more time in the LLM evaluation, or do you want to transition on how we can translate the human evaluation into an automated um, evaluation metrics.
Yeah, I guess we raised like a good set of like interesting question around the human of like, why are we using them as of now? What's going to be the use in some time? And I guess all those subjective decisions of will go like, as there is no good ways of like scoring them, you need to have ways of understanding like better the behaviors of the annotators and the type of decision around there. I guess that would be, yeah, I agree with you. That would be a nice transition towards the next, I would say the next type, like family of metric or type of ideas to score the LLM, which is around like the automation of this evaluation. So like, so previously we mentioned those two ideas. So like on the one extreme, they were like the old style metrics, which were like very scalable, very automated, but kind of limited. And on the other extreme, you could ask humans, like you could ask whatever you want. It's kind of interpretable, but it's just like too slow. So quite naturally, the idea that emerged I would say very soon was, is there a way to like use those models we're creating to evaluate themselves and to scale up the automation process while keeping some of the desideratas of the human evaluation method? And I would say things are moving super, super fast in this field. Like there's new like type of innovations every day. But yeah, I would say I like to see it as two different things. So let's start with a simple example. So you have a RAG model, like a ChatGPT type of things, and you're gonna ask the model a question about like how would I do this and that, and the model is gonna put you along like what would you recommend as a trip in like France for this summer. The model is gonna output you a long list of answers, or like an answer that might be of several bullet points and so on. And what you want is to be able to evaluate that properly. So the natural idea was saying, like, let's assume you have a ground truth answer. Like, let's assume you have something perfect. Before that, the way you would do is you would take like the perfect answer, you would take like the answer from the model, and you would like compute the blur score, the root score, and so on. But then you run into the challenge we discussed. So the natural idea that came was, well, could we ask a model to do the human, like the job of an annotator? So you would say, here's the question, here is like the answer from the model, here would be like the perfect answer. Can you compare me like the two answers? And so the whole thing would be like around the work of the prompt of, is like is there a way to automate that by giving a precise set of instruction and so on? On like this is really easy to set up because you just need like the question, some form of like perfect answers, and then you would ask the model and like extract from the model answers the response. Now let's talk a bit about like, and I think most of the people who built application kind of experimented with that, and there's like fairly sophisticated libraries which are doing this type of work as of now. What are like so those are the positive aspects. It's quite fast, it's quite cheap. You can ask more or less what you want, and it tends to succeed very well. So like the model understands the question, understands the answer, and is able to do more sophisticated things. Now, where is that failing? So there is a couple of things I see around there. One of the main one is, and it relates to the problem of the expert in the loop. It's very difficult given one answer to score it like from 1 to 5 on all the criteria at the same time. Because like the answer for someone might be a like 2 out of 5, whereas someone like if you give me this type of trip in Paris and I love sport and there is no sport in the question, I might just say like this is a 2 out of 5, whereas someone else who like food might be super happy with the answer. So there is this idea of scoring something which is like open-ended and quite generic on a limited numerical scale is very difficult. So the way the automation evolve is by breaking down one single evaluation metric into set of smaller metrics. So you would say, well, I might want to evaluate like conciseness, factuality, helpfulness, and all the other ones. And now it becomes easier for the model because you could like it's kind of simpler to say, is this answer concise or not? And like scoring it from 1 to 5 rather than saying, is it a good answer, when no one really knows what a good answer means. And
Mm.
the way this evaluation evolve is by saying, well, so I break it down into like set of criterias, and now we're starting to have a fairly good vision of what are the relevant criterias. And then for each of them, I'm going to get an individual score. So instead of saying on average my model gets 3.5 out of 10, I'll get like my model gets 3.5 in factuality, but it also gets 9 out of 10 in conciseness and like 8 in precision and those type of things. So you designed on those
Got
three
it.
metrics, and each of the metrics is going to correspond to a prompt. So that's very simple. Your prompt is going to be, this prompt is focusing on like this metric, and this one is focusing on this other metric. So what's
Yes.
interesting is you get a more. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to invest this time since you're already mentioning like all of those different metrics. Um, I want to understand from your own point, how do we decide which one actually is relevant to our own application that we are building? And I'm not talking about the LLM evaluation as a foundational model. I'm talking about the people who are interested to building LLM based applications using
Mm.
RAG. You mentioned RAG and maybe even fine tuned and slash RAG. So for those type of application, have we had like some type of maybe generic metrics that could be applicable for everybody? And then from there, you can use those common metrics, I would say it. You mentioned conciseness and you mentioned relevancy. And I think those are must be like relevant to so many of the applications. But how we do design like those platform of matrix, if you could say so, and how I can pick and choose what is applicable for my own application.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I would say mm, so the first type of question when I see this problem, I'm asking myself is there a notion of like factual knowledge? Like, is this a task which requires like finding from some specific knowledge and having the right answer is very important? So in this case, like
Mhm.
factuality is going to be core. Or is this a task which is more like centered around like a discussion or like helpfulness in general, like assisting someone, helping it? If you have them like this checklist of like there is a knowledge base and I want to retrieve something and people are going to ask that. So couple of examples for that would be like I have company data and people within my company are asking things about that. Or I have like FAQs and people want to find information. Or I'm selling a product and I want people to ask questions. Most of the enterprise use case are going to be around that. So whenever this happens, I tend to believe we're still at a stage where like factuality is going to be core about it. So people are going to say, first, am I getting the correct answer? And then if it's the correct answer, is it like concise enough? Is it helpful? Is it so on? But like checklist
Mm.
number one is going to be factuality. And for those, there is some metrics which are helpful, like precision-based type of metric, factual knowledge around that, which are only looking at this aspect of is the model correct or incorrect? When I'm asking a question, does it get the good document for those? And
Got it.
you can either work with the prompt or then look at the RAG systems in general and saying like, okay, I'm asking this question. The like retrieval thing model that is associated to my LLM retrieves those documents. Are those the good ones or the bad ones, independently of the answer? So point one is factuality, and do I get that? And I guess we'll be pretty soon at the stage where like whenever there is information that is available out there, the model is going to be able to retrieve it. I see factuality as being one of the early stage type of problems before moving towards more interesting metrics. Then, whenever you look at that, that's I would say top one criteria. You want to also look at like how is the model answering. So depending on whether your product is like customer facing, you might be worried about like safety type of problems or helpfulness. I see the way I see it is I want to maximize my accuracy or like the accuracy of my models subject to some helpfulness constraints. So basically, I want the model to be relatively safe, relatively helpful, relatively concise, but I'm not maximizing on that. What I really want to know is like, is it super accurate about those tasks? And the way I'm going to evaluate those helpfulness metrics is here like looking at the style. So asking question about like, is it concise? Is it like I can yeah, like you're gonna look at what your customers are looking, what are like the typical complaint about that, what is like the community driving or pushing the things, and then you're gonna build around that. Typically,
So
okay,
if I
go ahead.
understand you properly here, so what you're advising is look into what type of task you're trying to achieve with their application. And then from there, that could give you a good direction into what type of metrics that you need to integrate and maybe what type of metrics that you need to customize specifically
Yeah.
for your own use case. That is a great point right there. Let me pick your mind on some of the limitation of using the LLM as a judge or LLM as an
Mm,
evaluator. What are the shortcoming of this type of approach? To my understanding, like something called echo chamber effect, where we have a risk that of creating this echo chamber where LLM simply reinforcing its own bias and
mm.
errors in its own evaluation. And beside this, what is like the main challenges and limitation when it comes to using the LLM to evaluate itself?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. I would say. So let me think. Yeah. So some of them. Let's move from like early like low range limitations towards the more complex one. I think the echo chamber is like a fairly sophisticated type of limitation. The most obvious one is like there is some issues with, like, I call that robustness, or some form of, I can ask the LLM to evaluate itself or to evaluate a question, and then if I change 2 or 3 things in the prompts, it's gonna answer something completely different. So if I turn the question in another way, or if I remove, like, switch the order of the answer, it's gonna like give a different output. And that's partially related to what you discussed earlier on about like annotators. If you ask something at a different time of the day, they might like have a different answers. So there is still this idea of we don't fully understand how is the model behaving, what's happening, and it's giving us a good proxy that's mimicking humans, but we should always be cautious about like all the bias that are happening in these proxies. They're like low level bias. And then what's become more interesting is like, so those would be for evaluating answers, but then you want to ask questions which are more sophisticated about your models. And I would say typically those questions might happen for like the people building the model by itself. So like the top AI companies behind that. They're interested in saying like, what are the bias of my model long term? And do I want to go in that direction? And one of the challenges is that most of them, the way things are done at this level to evaluate like if your model have some limitation is by relying on the model itself to evaluate it.
Mhm.
So one example would be you want to know if your model is going to behave differently with some minority groups. So you're going to generate scenarios which might involve those groups. So like might involve question type as that by those type of scenarios. And then you're going to like prompt the model with those ones and evaluate the output of this. So there is a self-reinforcing effect of the model is going to generate something that comes from his own like learning set or like his own way of seeing the world, and then he's going to evaluate himself about this. So there is some edge scenarios and some edge cases you won't be able to catch because the model won't be able to generate them from the very beginning. And I see this is where I believe it's going to be very important to have the sweet balance between human like in the loop
Mhm.
and human providing data, human providing annotation, providing scenarios, and having the model to empower this and to scale this up. But relying only on the model is not going to be enough, and relying only on the human, on the other hand, is not going to be enough either.
That is really important point, and I think a lot of people are hyped up by this automated LLM evaluation. I love it. Like you said, it provide you with a lot of sanity checks and early smoke testings for your own outputs. But when you are talking about an enterprise application, you
Mm,
really cannot take the evaluation lightly. You cannot only rely
yeah.
on 100% LLM evaluation uh, based on the LLM evaluating itself. One of the
Mm,
main issue that I came across in some of the domains, such as laws and education and healthcares, those LLM, when used to evaluate themselves, um, they're kind of lacking the ability to evaluate the um, text based on ethical and moral and social
mm,
standards, and which is a very important and a major
yeah.
issue when it comes to generating language. And that's why I think the main approach, what you mentioned, is this kind of balance between do not drop human from the loop because they're still important, but maybe we need to redefine the role that human is actually playing in the loop. So instead of just dumping
Mm,
everything to them, let's try to assign what's what's good for the LLM evaluation,
mm,
and then let's segregate those tasks and just give the human what we need them to evaluate as well. Um, so yeah, I think that's really important, and I think a lot of those tools, at least that I have seen in the last, I would say, 6 months, they are 100% focusing on bringing this LLM evaluation with neglecting the human in the loop as
yeah.
well. So, giving this, do you know, like, or aware of any platform that they are combining both LLM evaluation and human evaluation in this case?
That's an
Libraries
interesting
or
question. I would say the like the research community is looking, basically I see different stacks of the research community is very much looking at the LLM evaluation at the moment because it's easier for them to access and like there's like a ton of interesting research question or like open problems which are associated with that, but they're not the one building the products for like the companies. And the way I see it is there is also this type of company that appeared working on LLM, like delivering applications, but they weren't exclusively focusing on first at evaluation. And that's quite natural because you don't really want to evaluate a product before you actually have a product. So the evaluation question always come after like having something to deliver and then the customer starting to complain or saying, this is something I want to improve or I want to measure and then I want to improve. I would say I suspect in the coming weeks or months, very soon there's a lot of companies which are going to suggest some offering around the space of evaluation. And those companies are going to either come from the one that are like traditionally offering LLM products, and then they'll
Hmm.
shift towards like complementing this product with some ways of evaluating it, or coming from the like set of people who like have developed an expertise in terms of human annotation or like more
Hmm.
generally evaluation process, and they will empower that with like providing LLM based solutions. And the trade-off is going to be people having the LLM or like people developing the LLM technologies. They will have access to the customer needs. They will see like clearly what are the customer asking for, but they don't have the expertise to work with annotators to properly do the evaluation, to do all this like tedious work of removing the bias, cleaning, learning the quality. On the other hand, the companies that have this expertise, they need to have a way to be infused with like the concrete problems and the evaluation axis that like do matter for the customers, and the one which are like more nice to have, but not necessarily like core to the product, or they won't be the ones on which the like final decisions will be taken.
So what you're saying, that's the most suitable company profile to do this job is those company that has been working in annotation and providing human in the loop and human expertise for different dialects, different languages, different domains. So they're gonna be suited much better than other companies because they already have the foundation of that. Now they just need to adapt into the LLM evaluation domain and maybe integrate some of this automated LLM. Did I
Mm.
understand properly?
That would be sort of I would say the expertise that is developed around that is something that might make a real difference. Whereas because the LLM field is fairly recent, like everyone is learning on this aspect. So you have less an edge about like I'm being able to develop a product because there is not that many LLM products out there, and the way people are using it and so on changes almost every day. On the other hand, the way of like learning and be able to work with annotators and to observe that and have like all those volumes of ambiguous data is something that takes years to learn and has been there for a long time and is likely still going to be there also for longer. So if I had to make a bet, I would say I would more look towards this area and then move towards the other one rather than the opposite. But then again, things are like really difficult to predict in the field, so we'll see
Hmm.
how it evolves or how things are turning.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is this idea of limitation of adaptability. So when we're relying on some LLM that has been trained on a specific data, regardless how large is that data set, but you still have them kind of not adapting so well to new and unseen
Mm,
data, and rapidly evolving language trends and their own evaluation. And I think that's one of the main things. I think if involving human smartly in the process, it could help us with that kind of adaptability type of issue as well.
yeah.
That's definitely the case. I wanted to
Mm,
pick up your mind on the challenges when it comes to the multi-modality, multi-lingual, and how
mm,
that kind of complexity propagate on how we can evaluate those LLM.
yeah. I would say, let me bring a last before switching to this topic. I would one mental picture I have in mind is also when you take the basically those models are becoming increasingly intelligent and like are able of like doing increasingly more complex tasks. So whenever you have a system that's built for the purpose of doing one simple thing well identified and do it well, it's very easy to evaluate. Now we build models which are more complex, more able, and they do long tail problems. Basically, they're able to do things you haven't learned like teach them to do. And a good model for that is like, I'm very constantly thinking about it, is like whenever you have students or like humans, they're able to do this. And high school is basically, or like school or any form of education, is like teaching them new knowledge and trying to measure the way of like how would they behave with this new knowledge. And what's interesting is when you look at the way you grade or like you evaluate the students, it hasn't changed in like centuries, or like not centuries, but you still do the same type of exams or the same type of ranking. And like I would take physics 101 or like math 101. I learn
Hmm.
super complex field like textbooks, but then my exam might be something very simple and typically unrelated to what's being used for like the downstream task. So it also tells us something about the challenge of evaluation in general, of people fairly smart has been like some of the smartest people in the world are like working in academia and like they're teaching courses, they're evaluating courses. So they must have thought about this problem for the set of students. And still it hasn't changed that much, or like we still at a very early like there hasn't been that many innovation around this space. So it's interesting to see, is that because the whole process of evaluation wasn't scalable for the teacher, so it was limiting itself? Or is it by itself because it's too complicated and creating the set of situations which are realistic to evaluate, or creating the good set of problems, creating something which might be personalized to the task or the student is too difficult? And
That is very interesting take. I would admit I never heard of that. That's really great way, because you're right. I mean, evaluating the human knowledge, it has been there forever. Like, and
yeah,
maybe borrowing some of the concept that we have used, it could be beneficial. But at the same time, it raised the doubt that did we really evaluate the human knowledge 100%?
mm,
Because as you may know, it's if you're going to a specific school in France and maybe another school in rural area, it's not going to be the same complexity and hardness. Like, a lot of people fail in the major schools because
mm,
they're just designing much better tests that make the whole idea of evaluating human is more complex and more competitive. So it require more hard works. So you're right. I think there is something to borrow from that field, and but I'm not sure how they're going to be adapted. But I think that's
yeah.
really good analogy right there.
Mm. And there's going to
Yes.
be back and forth. Basically, what we'll learn about the models. So we discussed a lot about like customization and personalization of like you have a task and you want to learn how your model is performing on your task and across a different set of criteria. As we learn this and we know how to better do that, that's something we're going to bring then to evaluation, either like in academic setting or like in like work setting or evaluation, of being able to have better metrics and to evaluate them more properly. So I suspect we like building things to like evaluate LLMs, but a lot of those tools might be used then to evaluate on some ways or others humans in a bit, like I would say it wouldn't be evaluation just for the sake of evaluation, but being able to better understand the limitations and the like strengths of a student rather than having the same tests or like same benchmark for everyone. Yeah, we'll
That's
see.
that's really good. Yeah, I know some schools, at least, they would be separating the talented students from the average students. So even they designing like a specific test for them and all of that.
Mm,
So uh, I could see this applicable to use cases and the type of data that
mm,
if you have like very sensitive data that you don't want to compromise, or you need it to be retrieved with 100% accuracy, so you might isolate them and encapsulate them and then do like a specific evaluation for them. That could be
yeah.
a very interesting part of it. So yeah, I wanted to bring you back into my
Oh yeah.
main segue of the multimodality, if we can just spend a few minutes,
Oh yeah.
and multi language as well, because talking about different languages, not all languages are created equal, obviously. So
Yeah.
every language, it introduces its own challenges, in terms maybe of the writing style, the way that you form your own language, all of those. So how do you think this affect the LLM evaluation? And is it possible to use just some generic metrics for all languages, or we need a specific metrics for each one of those languages based on the
Yeah.
use cases?
Yes, that's me. Mm, let me let's start by the language then, and then we'll switch slowly towards the multimodality, which extends
Sure.
beyond. I would say the way I see it so far is that although apparently the models are able to like kind of access a wide scope of language, so like they're not limited or constrained by saying something has to be done in English. I, from what I've seen, the evaluation work mostly revolve around like being able to do something in English. So being able to capture all the subtleties and like all the fine-grained evaluation metric is something as of now we are only able to do in one language. And the type of techniques which are developed are somehow a bit overfitting this like English language by like learning some distributions over the world, learning some like form of vocabulary. So they won't be able, like it won't be able to be extended easily towards other things. So like either commonly spoken language, such like all the other ones, like the top 5 or top 10 most speak language for which there is a lot of data. And that's going to be even more difficult as you move not only towards like after the top 10 language, but like the top 100 or like top 1000 ones. And what's going to be like, I would say it's pretty much an open question of like, should the model continue to like increase in scope and like being able to continue to like cover all those language, or should it specialize in some of the direction and make some sacrifice of saying it's only going to be supporting those like 5 main ones, and for those one we'll provide a good evaluation but we won't be able to adapt beyond those ones. I suspect the like I said a bit like funnily, you could say, well, one way of evaluating one language would be just like translate everything back to English and then translate force. And the way I see it is that's pretty much the best we can do as of now, unless like given the set of strategies most people are looking at. And there is a real need to like have better tooling and have better solutions which are able to look at other language. One the big challenge here is, I suspect, as always, the data. Like to learn how to evaluate, you need like evaluation related data. So we discussed a lot about annotators, we discussed about like models generating other type of data for other language. Those models by itself, they learn on like data which is related to one language. And if we want to operate better for language which have less amount of data, we need to like find ways to like deal with this sparsity, like evolve in the low
Mm.
data setting. And like the success of LLM came from like increasingly scaling the volume of data rather than reducing it. So the idea of being able to work, we said, how can we work with more? So how can I get to 1 trillion token, 10 trillion token, 100 trillion token? How can I scale up more? But never how can I scale up like with less? And the do more with less involve completely different like technical ideas. So we'll see if we either able to develop those technical ideas or we able to like use the models we created to better do things. And that comes back to this echo chamber. So you could say, well, if I have less data about one language, I could create more of this data with my LLM. But then what the LLM currently knows of the language is going to condition all what's being created. And therefore it's going to like reinforce this like limited scope vision it had initially. It's, I would say it's like something that's going to move a lot in the coming years, the multi-language idea, because there is obviously a need for something that goes beyond simple English. But on the other hand, we don't know how to support that as of now. And the use case might differ also across language. And that's going to be interesting. Like for example, like some company use cases related might be exclusively in English. Some other use cases more like, it's tricky to find some of them as of now immediately, but I suspect different language are going to focus on different things. Like a lower source language coming from like a limited set of people might not be interested by like, or if you do things in Latin, for instance, you're not going to do things which are related to like financial earnings or like other type of problems or even mathematic problems. So do you want to support everything for the Latin, or do you want to focus only on the use case which is most relevant for this one?
It's funny that you mentioned like the domain itself, because even beside the language, if you need to cover more languages or more dialect from the same language, you have another challenge where if you have multi-domain, You need an accuracy for each domain. Do you need it an open domain? Do you need it
Mm,
to be tailored for that specific 2 or 3 domains? That's an added complexity as well. And that's why, at least what I have seen so far, I think we're still early in this development. But a lot of people,
mm,
they just focus in English, one
yeah,
specific task, most likely couple metrics here and there. Um, and I've heard a lot of people advocating on when you build those LLM based application, you really need your own leaderboard. You can use some of the
yeah,
generic leaderboard, but at the end of the day, you need to invest in your own. So, what is your thought behind, um, like for the executive suites to invest in the LLM evaluation? Because I think it's underestimated, and
mm,
sometimes they just overlooked. They say, okay, as long as we have some retrieval system, it's good enough, and they are not aware of all of those details and
yeah.
the evil in the details when you look into it. So what is your thoughts behind this, if you're going to be approaching any executive to convince them to invest in this LLM evaluation? What is the
Yeah.
main talking points?
Yeah, it's very good. So one of the project I'm working on at the moment is basically being able to create this custom leaderboard for any set of tasks. And that's a paper we're going to submit in a conference in like 4 days. So like
Okay.
wrapping things up. But typically, I'm very much advocating for the idea of you want to build your custom task, you're going to have a way, like you need a way to evaluate it. And then this is something that's going to follow you across time. So you will build the first evaluation something early, and then you're going to push it more and more and like make it more comprehensive, make it more like cover more use case. In terms of the advice to like decision makers and people, I would say evaluation is not something you choose to some extent. It's not a feature of the product that's nice to have. What's
Mm,
going to happen is that you're going to release a product, and most of the time, you're going to realize that you've neglected the evaluation, and you're going to run into a lot of troubles. And those troubles are going to be like they're going to have high consequence because customers are going to typically they involve customer. And as a customer experience, I used to have access to like documentation or to humans, and then suddenly you give me a model in front of me. And if the model is going to do nonsense, that's a terrible experience because it says not only the company didn't really care about my experience, but then this like creating something that tells me something like wrong or incorrect.
mm,
So that's typically it's something, or at least as a customer, if this happens to me, I know I would have a very negative vision of the company and I might like quit or like stop buying the product and so on. And I think decision maker they know that very well, and that's something they're able to track closely. So if they release model and they see like numbers that start to go down without even understanding why, without like being able to say, is the evaluation not at the level, like something like that, they will have to invest in evaluation. And the sooner they do it, the better it is
mm.
because you're able to know in what direction you need to invest. Is it
Let
the
me ask you
retrieval?
this.
Is it the
In terms of workload between the LLM customization and fine tunings and the LLM evaluation, in terms of workload, is it 50-50? Is it 70-30? Like, how do you assess it? Like in a real
mm,
world enterprise application, like how much time we spend in both sides?
the way the way I see it is at the beginning of the project or when you start to build a product, you almost like doing 90% development of those things. So like creating the retrieval, connecting to some source, creating some customization levels, indexing the data, all of this work. It's like 90% of development, 10% of evaluation. And
Mm,
then this is stage one. Then stage two is you tend to release your model, you're fairly happy. And very quickly, and I suspect most of the cases happen like this, you realize that the accuracy is not good enough. And then people start to ask questions. They ask, why is it not good enough and where is it not good enough? And suddenly you have no ways of like showing any of those numbers, not to understand it properly. And at this time, you load shift more towards like 30% of development and 70% of evaluation. And why is that also? Because on the one hand, LLM systems are surprisingly easy to build. So like it's not that difficult to build or like to consume an LLM product. Like the models out there, like doing retrieval system is not that complicated. What's more difficult is to improve them. So once you release the first proof of concept and you want to develop, like, improve the accuracy of the model, assuming you can measure it, it's
Hmm.
fairly difficult. Like, fine-tuning is more complex, playing with the retrieval systems, the embedding models is also more complex. You need to invest a lot of time. So those two things are happening at the same time. You release the proof of concept, and then you realize it's not good enough. You don't know how, and you don't know which axis, and then you don't necessarily know how to improve it at the same time. So what happens typically, or what I observe, is that people tend to work first on, like, the evaluation, and they, like, start to build some suite or, like, some set of techniques or some metrics they can optimize on, while at the same time learning or, like, exploring on what can be done to improve the system. And I would say longer term, so it might be separate team, but it should, like, the effort is likely going to be 50%, 50%. 50% of development and, like, building new features or trying new techniques, and 50% of, like, being able to evaluate the downstream impact. And it's always back and forth.
And would you advocate to be the same team or maybe totally different teams?
That's a good question. I would say in our case here, different teams are looking at the problem. So there is teams who build, like, expertise in the evaluation process, and then they review the work which is being done by, like, other teams which develop, like, the features. I
Mm.
I tend to see it as there's gonna be expertise needed to do evaluation. So, like, in 3 years, people would be, like, expert in just evaluating the models. There would be product built around that, and you will be focusing on this aspect only, and that would be a full-time job, I think, just for you. But you need to have, like, having connection with the product is always something which is helpful. And the same way happens now of, like, in companies, you want, like, your scientists or your software engineers to, like, discuss with customers and know how things are being done. And the same way, like, it's gonna remain this way, I suspect, for some time. But the way I see it, if it's within, like, if it's different team or same team, if it's the same team, some people in the team are gonna be dedicated only to evaluation, and some people are gonna be dedicated to some other aspects of the product.
And maybe
So,
it's a good idea to keep them separate because you don't need any bias in the way that you build your
mm,
own data set and all of that. So I could see the value why probably we're going to need them to be separated. Gauthier, maybe we're going to have to do another episode. There is a lot of great insights. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being here. And maybe till next time.
yeah, well, thanks for, like, all the great question, and
All right.
looking forward if there's a next time or, like, follow-up questions.